how he envisages the defense force now and into the future. What is less clear, however, is how this is going to be concretized. Given the fact that we do have a serious problem in my mind, which is that we don't have enough money. That is a reality that we have to face. And secondly, I'm not sure whether we have a government today or not. But perhaps by this afternoon we will know. And of course, when we have the new government, whether or not they're going to carry on with this defense white paper, or we may get a second defense white paper. So, with that in mind, I'd like to just introduce our speakers. On my right, Tim Huxley, well known, of course, for his book that many of us have read, Defending the Lion City. Tim is an old friend of mine. We have not met for many years, actually. But he now runs the IISS office in Singapore. He's one of the key players in terms of the military balance that the IISS produces, and also he helps to run the Fullerton and the Shangri-La dialogues in Singapore. Thank you very much, Tim, for coming. And of course, on my left is our Deputy Secretary of Defense. He has a long history in the public service, and of course, being in the Defense Ministry, he will share with us many of the insights that he has in terms of the Defense White Paper and how it will be implemented. This is an open forum. I like to believe that, I like to impose the chat. I don't know whether the media is present, but if they are, then they must also subscribe to these rules. We have roughly about 1 hour and 5 minutes, I believe. I don't know how long it will speak, 10 minutes? About 12 minutes? 12 minutes, okay. Around there. I think we'd like to have a much more open discussion, and the question and answers, I think, will be very important. Of course, Dr. Huxley's points has to be seen in perspective, because he comes with the outside view of the Defense White Paper, and because he's a leading analyst in strategic matters, the points that are raised in the Defense White Paper naturally needs to be looked at in a wider perspective than just from a Malaysian perspective. And of course, from the domestic side, we will get maybe an inside government view in some fashion, in terms of how the Defense White Paper, how it's going to be implemented. And in this respect, of course, we know that the civilian aspect of the Ministry of Defense is very important, and how they're able to work together with the armed forces in trying to achieve the objectives spelled out in the Defense White Paper. In the brief that was given to me, the 3 pillars of the Defense White Paper were more or less emphasized, and that we already have heard, basically on concentric deterrence. Second one is about the comprehensive defense, and the third one is about credible partnerships. I think these are the 3 pillars that we must discuss and perhaps assess in terms of how it can be achieved in the longer run, in terms of national planning and in terms of our national defense. So on that note, let me begin by asking Tim to begin, and then we'll proceed to the next speaker, and after that we'll have an open discussion. Please, yes, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Mindef and Midas very much for inviting me to offer some comments today. I feel honored to be here and to be in such distinguished company. I'd like to start by commending CDF's keynote lecture, which I think provided an authoritative and clear perspective on the way forward in implementing the 3-pillar defense strategy that is outlined in the Defense White Paper. I'd also like to applaud the Defense White Paper initiative itself and the way in which the DWP process has been implemented and brought to fruition by Minister of Defense Masabu, Deputy Minister Senator Lu Chin Tong, and all in MINDEF, both military and civilian, who've been involved in the process. The Defence White Paper represents a true milestone for Malaysian defence in terms of setting out with a lot of clarity and transparency the thinking behind Malaysia's defence policy and defence strategy, and in outlining how the government sees the development of the country's defence capability proceeding over the next decade. The White Paper is important for several reasons specifically. First, it explains to Malaysians the rationale for the nation's defence policy and how that defence policy can be implemented. Second, it sets the course for the development of the Malaysian Armed Forces capability. And third, it will help to build confidence with Malaysia's external defence and security partners in this region and more widely. I think I should also mention that the DWP is significant in terms of fulfilling at the national level a commitment made by members of the ASEAN Regional Forum soon after it was established in 1994 to publish defence white papers regularly as part of a wider commitment to confidence building in the interests of regional security. As it happens, that long-standing commitment by ARF members has only been fulfilled patchily by most countries in the region. As a general rule, I think it's perhaps unsurprising that democratic countries in the Asia Pacific have tended to be more systematic in their approach to producing DWPs than those that have had less democratic political systems. The process of producing a defence white paper is an important and useful exercise, not least because it forces a country's defence establishment to go back to basics. It makes politicians, civil servants and military officers consider carefully defence practice and policy, what they do and why they do it. Reading this first Malaysian DWP, I was impressed by the depth of thinking and effort that evidently went into the white paper process during the year or so before the DWP's tabling in Parliament on 2nd of December and its general release soon afterwards. I was also impressed by the white paper's realistic and common sense approach. It does not set grandiose, lofty or potentially unattainable goals for Malaysia's defence policy and its armed forces capabilities. This is not simply because of the economic cost and government spending trade-offs that setting unattainable goals would inevitably involve. The white paper also reflects an important starting point for Malaysia's defence policy. Like those of its fellow members of ASEAN, Malaysia's defence policy is genuinely defensive. Unlike some countries historically, and some in the present day, Malaysia does not seek security at the expense of others. Of course, limited offensive strategies and weapons may be needed for deterrence and for defensive purposes, but Malaysia is not planning to invade other countries, and it does not need substantial and expensive power projection capabilities. And if every country had that basic stance, this region and the world would be safer, more prosperous and happier. The notions of Malaysia as a maritime nation with continental roots and as a bridging linchpin between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, I think together provide an interesting and persuasive conceptual framework for examining the country's geopolitical circumstances and defence requirements. However, it is the three pillars of defence strategy which provided the focus for the CDF's excellent keynote lecture: concentric deterrence, comprehensive defence, and credible partnerships, which constitute the essential core of the DWP. These three pillars explain clearly and sensibly, respectively, the role of the Malaysian Armed Forces in protecting Malaysia's interests in the so-called core extended forward areas. Second, the importance of whole of government and whole of society approaches in support of the national defence effort. And third, the need to intensify Malaysia's external defence partnerships in its region and beyond. I'd like to mention another important aspect of the Defence White Paper that I found impressive. It relates to work that we're doing in my organisation. Working closely with the Defence and Military Analysis Programme at the IISS headquarters in London, at IISS Asia in Singapore, we've been doing a lot of research over the last year or so on the real meaning of military capability in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly in terms of the diverse elements that contribute to capability. So, for me it was heartening to see that Malaysia's first Defence White Paper not just recognises, but indeed emphasises that military capability is not just about the number of pieces of major military equipment that a country possesses, or how much it spends on defence, or how many personnel there are in its armed forces. Those elements of national military capability are all important. But in reality, capability is derived from a much wider array of factors. Capability, as this Defence White Paper makes clear in relation to Malaysia, is also about other important elements, notably doctrine, training, recruitment, morale, welfare, leadership, not to mention infrastructure, logistics, and defence science, technology, and industrial support. And crucially, capability derives from jointness, in other words, joint service thinking, joint planning, and joint operations. In sum, I think this Defence White Paper is a very good starting point for a richer understanding of and also debate over Malaysia's current and future defence policy and capabilities. If it's to have lasting significance, however, I think it will need to be seen as the first in a series of regular white papers that will provide updates on the progress of MINDEF and the Malaysian Armed Forces as they move towards the goals that are set out in this initial iteration. So, assuming that this is not Malaysia's last, as well as its first Defence White Paper, I hope you won't mind if I make several suggestions for future editions. First, the White Paper could perhaps clarify Malaysia's fundamental international orientation. I felt slightly confused by the various descriptions of this in this White Paper, which in different places describe Malaysia as neutral, as non-aligned, and as manifesting activist neutrality. These, I think, shouldn't be seen as interchangeable terms. Neutrality is a much more demanding and rigorous posture than non-alignment. Activist neutrality seems to be a complex and interesting idea, but perhaps it could have been explained in a little bit more detail in the White Paper. This may be a relatively simple matter of something having been lost in the process or lost in translation, but I think it's important to get this straight because this fundamental posture should provide the very basis on which Malaysia's defence policy and capabilities are built. I think it would be worth having an introductory section setting this out a little bit more clearly. Second, the White Paper, I think, could set out with greater precision the external security challenges that Malaysia faces and which provide the vital context for defence policy and the development of MAF capability. I know that with good reason there is a tradition, not only in Malaysia, but also in other members of ASEAN, of not pointing fingers at specific countries that are seen as sources of geopolitical challenge or threat, in case they might be offended, thereby worsening relationships which may already be, as we say in this region, quite often sensitive. But my own view is that a more frank assessment of the threats faced by Malaysia would be useful, not just in helping people to understand the rationale for the country's defence policy and programs, but also in terms of making it clear to any country or countries that are causing unease to Malaysia that there are costs in terms of the reaction that they are provoking. Third, I must mention the important chapter on international defence engagement. It's truly impressive that Malaysia's defence establishment has developed such a wide array of bilateral, minilateral and multilateral connections in Southeast Asia, the wider region and internationally. But I think it would be worthwhile in future white papers to convey a clearer sense of the strategy behind such a wide, indeed widening, array of international defence engagements. Which of these partnerships are the most important ones in functional terms? And on the other hand, which are essentially exercises in defence diplomacy? Into which ones will MINDEF and the MAF put more effort and resources in the future? In particular, a focus on the strategy for enhanced defence cooperation in Malaysia's immediate Southeast Asian neighbourhood, whether bilateral, trilateral or multilateral through the ADMM would be valuable. This would need, of course, to be placed in the broader framework of Malaysia's evolving foreign policy. It would be important to set out regional defence cooperation ambitions more clearly, because these could provide a way for Malaysia to mitigate the vulnerabilities that result from being caught amidst major power rivalry. Cooperation with other Southeast Asian countries strikes me as absolutely vital for Malaysia's security future. In other words, how is Malaysia planning to use its national resilience to build greater regional resilience? Fourth, some hard data would be a useful addition to the white paper. In the interests of transparency and to provide a stronger basis for understanding the current status of Malaysia's defence provision and of how plans for the future will affect it, I suggest that future iterations of the white paper could usefully include a table showing the country's defence budget and spending over at least the previous decade at current and constant prices and as percentages of government spending in GDP. Graphics showing defence spending broken down by service and by functional categories, in other words, operations, personnel, development. A breakdown of military and civilian personnel, at least into joint and then single service categories, and by gender. An order of battle showing the MAF's organisation and listing the main formations and units of each service. A list of the major equipment holdings for each service. A graphic showing how the Malaysian armed forces will look different in the future. And finally, a list of the major bilateral and multinational exercises that the MAF takes part in. And finally, I think it might be valuable for the Defence White Paper to look more than 10 years ahead. As this White Paper makes clear at several points, the 4D MAF and also the single service plans already do that. But in the interest of setting out an even better coordinated, long-term joint service approach, and in recognizing the long time frames for major equipment programs, perhaps looking towards a 20 to 30 year horizon in future white papers might be worthwhile. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk about my thoughts on the Defence White Paper. In conclusion, I'd like to say again that the White Paper has made a truly valuable contribution in terms of transparency, in cultivating greater engagement in the debate over Malaysia's defence and security, and in building confidence regionally. I hope that it is just the first in a long series of such documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for a very constructive critique, I might say, of the Defence White Paper. I won't be around when they write the next Defence White Paper, but I think the writing team, the team that did the White Paper, they did it in record time, and there were certain political expedients that was necessary so that we could get it out to Parliament last year. But I want to say that I think the points you have made are very crucial. I think one of the points that definitely the white paper doesn't really spell out is really the state of the defense force in Malaysia. In my mind, we have a small defense force with limited capabilities, and they're basically geared to dealing with, I would say, low intensity to maybe to medium intensity conflict. And one of the problems that the armed forces have is the nature of capabilities. This is very difficult to do, especially because the resources are not so, the resources are one thing, not only in terms of defense industry, but also in terms of the available monies made to the defense force. So the defense force is basically caught with that situation. Therefore, to do planning to the future is quite difficult. But nonetheless, I think that is something that they must focus on. And one problem that you mentioned, right, because there's no explicit external threat that's been mentioned. Whereas I believe that there is an explicit threat. But the defense white paper is very silent in some ways, in a large way. And finally, I do want to say, because we have Australians in the audience, I do want to say that if we're talking about credible partnerships, it's a relationship with Australia that I think Malaysia should bank on. And I think we should have a greater relationship in terms of defense with the Australians. Not because the Australians are here, but I just want to say that, I think the Malaysia-Australia defense partnership is probably the best bilateral relationship in the world in terms of defense cooperation. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn to Tuan Ahmad Nazri. Sir, if we can begin, please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First morning. Dr. King, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. Well, King has, I think, spoke almost fundamentally everything that we need to cover this morning. Pretty much whatever that I was planning to say. Well, it's good. I mean, he has tremendous experience in managing and looking at a number of perspectives in terms of not just regional defense, but world as a whole. He has been conducting Shangri-La dialogue for many years, and also attending this June. Well, Kim has also raised a number of critical matters which in my team, well, some of them are here, and Kim has said, the chair had also said that we had produced, or Minda had produced the paper in quite a tremendous speed. In fact, it wasn't told before. Earlier on, we were given until about 6 months, to which we relentlessly negotiated again with the minister as well as the deputy minister. The government was pushing us very heavily then. I think, but all in all, I'm glad that we managed to conclude the paper in about a year. Although I think when we first voiced out our interest in forming such a paper, a number of our external partners say that it must be crazy to be trying to achieve in such a short space of time. Okay, nonetheless, I think four essential issues were noted by team which the Policy and Strategic Planning Division will take up as a secretariat to the paper. We will look at that again. But let me just reiterate that the Malaysian foreign postures, my counterpart from the foreign ministries are here. For general consumption, the Malaysian foreign postures are highly influenced by one is our complex neighborhood. Why we say that? complex that Malaysia is in arises from one, the previous political postures by our neighbors. We have a number of former communist-oriented countries to the north of Peninsula. The various economic dispositions that not just Malaysia has, but our neighbor surrounding us have, as well as one of the prominent ones is the overlapping boundaries claim that a number of the ASEAN countries are having at the moment. So essentially, when we posture the content of the white paper, we were very sensitive to what our neighbors may be thinking of such a write-up. We had different settings that we were experimenting back briefing to our political masters. Nonetheless, a number of good issues were raised by a team which I think is worthwhile for us to look at. In fact, one of team's suggestion was to include the budget spending, which the first iteration of the white paper actually had. It had. But when within Malaysia, it had to go through several scrutiny processes, one of which was the cabinet. Every piece of important paper will have to go through cabinet screening and cabinet approval, in which I will not detail out, but nonetheless, towards the end of our process, that detail was later removed. Okay. Well, I think we spoken pretty much about the whole three main chapters or main sections of the defense white paper. I'm going to touch bit and pieces here and there, one of which is the comprehensive defense or the internal resilience. It speaks about two parts. One is whole of government and the other one is whole of society. Previously, if you look at the previous iterations of the national defense policy beginning from 1970s, when we first introduced ours, with a number of iterations, it was on the threat basis, on the capability basis. Now it goes into an interest base or interest basis. Okay, our previous defense policy is just bringing back into perspective where we were before to fully understand and comprehend what we are trying to achieve in the next couple of years for this particular white paper. It looks for a 10-year period, but as had commented earlier, it would have been very good if we can spend it a little longer to encompass the three planning that the tri-services have. Well, indeed, it's not the first and the last. Hopefully, even with the change of government, it should persist. I think it would be very foolish for any government to immediately change a paper like this. It's very general, very generic in nature. Nonetheless, if we just look back into the last couple of iterations previous to the 2010, they were previously very selective, very descriptive to the majority of the public. So much so, nobody outside of the ambient of defense knew about where the policy was heading, what direction we were taking, what impact did it have. It had a lot of tremendous impact on defense sector per se. When we restrict information from the external parties, from interest parties, we gain less support then, which with less understanding, we receive less support, and it turned out to be less money as well. That's what we are trying to reverse now by engaging the whole of our society as well as the whole of government. By engaging them, we are keen in getting back their support. In what form? So the support of the whole of government, MINDEF is no longer looking to be a sole player for defense. we need our credible partners internally. We have Home Affairs Ministry, we have Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have many other ministries. Finance Ministry is our primary player as well. Ministry of Economic Affairs, and plus many others. Why we need those? Comprehensive defense is not just about equipment and personnel. It's a whole of nation resilience against not just internal threats but also external threats. How we're building them, we have to implement a number of other initiatives. They are not spelled out in this paper, but they are there for reference and to kickstart the other initiatives that perhaps we have to spearhead. Next is a whole of society approach. When we did this paper, we approached a number of societal organizations which contributed tremendously to the formation of that paper. They give us the perspective of what the society is looking for. I think we captured their intentions and summarized that into a number of our chapters. That whole of government as well as a whole of society approaches. If we look at the armed forces, the personnel, they will remain within their services. But if you look at the public service personnel serving in them, we are interchangeable. That was a summary among the service chief as well as the CDM. In fact, what we are looking to have is sectorial. This has yet to be implemented by the public service department. This is one of the ideas that we are toying with. I think it's worth to be pursuing further with the public service department. That to have a sectoral specific public service or public servant would benefit a lot to that for people to come in, not that discrediting any one of the civil servants, but for them to have an experience as well as an in-depth knowledge of how a force functions can contribute tremendously back to defense or any particular sector. So that is my brief take on whole of government and whole of society approaches. Next is, I do have more time, is a bit on governance. With large sum of money spent on MINDEF, I think MINDEF has consistently ranked about third or fourth after education and home affairs in terms of funding. It invites a large number of acquisitions. Be it true or otherwise, it doesn't matter what acquisitions or acquisitions. So it's up to MINDEF to steer and to overcome those acquisitions. Some of which are still under scrutiny by various investigative bodies, so let them be. But what we need are oversight mechanisms. This is outlined under the Defence Work Paper. One is Parliamentary Select Committee. Even before the Defence Work Paper came out, the Parliamentary Select Committee on Defence and Home Affairs has already been established. I think that's a pretty good defense or pretty good oversight mechanism that the Ministry of Defence is actively engaging with the Ministry of Home Affairs in terms of explaining to them the functionality, the running, as well as the troubles that we are having with defense as well as security. But also there are other oversight mechanisms that the Defence Work Paper proposes, one of which, three of which, it proposes three oversight mechanisms or planning mechanisms. One is the Defence Investment Committee. Well, it may say that investment committee, what does it have to do with oversight mechanism? But previously, you can refer back to my earlier commentary that we were secretly before with our planning and for obvious reasons at that point of time. But the Defence Investment Committee proposed to be chaired by PM or Prime Minister will have an overall bearing on the whole of nation. what we are seeing as a problem with multi-ministries having multi-inventory logistical damage. We have an defense investment committee chaired by the Prime Minister have a clear national directive. I think at this point, defense looks for the Prime Minister to take the architect, not just for Geneva, but relevant other agencies, for instance, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of International Trade, and Ministry of International Trade, and many other interlinked ministries that would give some leverage to how do we plan our defense and security ahead. We cannot be having different ministries running different inventories. That effect is a good and welcome initiative given by the Ministry of Finance. The second mechanism is Mindas Policy Committee. That committee is chaired by the Minister himself. Internally, this is one of the highest committee. It's currently running. It's being acknowledged by the Defense Worker as one of the oversight mechanism to not just control and select which policy directive we are heading, but what bearing do they have on defense overall. And finally, a defense reform committee, one that has been said by, been touched by the CDM, with the defense worker, a number of things it proposes, and including a number of reforms. This particular reform committee has yet to be established, will be headed jointly by SecGen as well as CDM. So these four oversight mechanism, two internal, two external, hopefully be able to guide our defense and security, not just defense, but defense and security of Malaysia in the probable and coherent ways for years to come. One last thing before I leave. The last note that we received or we heard that perhaps the defense worker can look into a longer time span. It is good to perhaps share with you that what we plan is a 3 phase or a 30-year program. The first defense worker looks for the first 10 years, and perhaps hopefully the two subsequent revisions will look into the subsequent 10 and plus. So we are looking at about 30 years and so ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me, and we hope for a good discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tuan Ahmad Nazri. I think Tuan Ahmad Nazri has highlighted some of the problems in terms of implementation as we go further in terms of operationalizing the defense white paper, especially in terms of not only government procurement but also in terms of decision making and the need for greater coordination between ministries in terms of the defense white paper. So ladies and gentlemen, I think we have roughly about 25 minutes in this session. I'd like to open the floor to question and answers and comments. The rules of engagement that if you want to speak, to get the microphone and then to introduce yourself and your organization. And please limit your intervention to your question instead of giving us a preamble about any other issue that you might think is pertinent or not pertinent to the discussion. So I open the floor.
We are part of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. First and foremost, I was happy to hear from I believe the keynote speech where they mentioned on the partnership between the defense and also say with the civilians. And for this, I would like to express our thanks to the Royal Malaysian Armed Forces for inviting the Malaysian Red Crescent to the recent five-power defense arrangement exercise or the Bersama Lima exercise earlier this year, because it shows that the civilians can also work together with the armed forces in times of armed conflict. I have a couple of questions here. The first one relates to what will happen based after today's discussion. Will all the points that are being raised, what will you do with it? What will the team do with it? This is the first question which I'm quite curious on. On the second part, earlier you've mentioned on the partnership. So there are, although sometimes there are matters that we, the auxiliary to the Malaysian government, the statutory body like Malaysia Red Crescent, we are involved in the dissemination of law of armed conflict, or IHL, International Humanitarian Law of the Public. The next question is, say, on the translation of the Geneva Convention into the Malay language. This is something which is necessary, and I believe that among our academicians from the universities and from the civilians and the specialists in this area, the experts, they can contribute. However, we need the leadership from the Ministry of Defense. Perhaps this is something that we can look at. And also with regard to the dissemination to the public, what happened to the National IHL Committee of Malaysia, or Jawatan Kuasa Undang-Undang Kemanusiaan Antarabangsa of Malaysia? I believe there has not been a meeting for the past 10 years. Perhaps this can be something that we look to in directing Malaysia in its defense for the future. Thank you.
These are not direct.
And on the points that I've mentioned, perhaps it can contribute to the future defense of Malaysia, because in addition to the armed forces, even the civilians, they do play a role. Thank you.
Okay, what will happen to the comments that we received or raised today? The Secretariat will collect them, will pass to the Central Division, that's the Policy and Strategic Planning Division, as a Secretariat to the White Paper. We will not amend the paper immediately, but we'll take those as our depository for the second edition or the revision. So that will happen to the comments or notes either taken today or along our Perwira dialogue series. As for the other two, on your suggestions for the Geneva Convention as well as the other committee on humanitarian, I think that's best taken up. We'll take note of that. We'll pass to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I mean, they are here, but I'm not sure whether they are willing to respond to that immediately. But we'll take up those, pass to them, and if need be, we'll bring it back to you in writing. Thank you, sir.
Can we have the next question?
My question is to Dr. Tim on your first recommendation about clarifying the fundamental posture of Malaysia's standing in international relations. I think this is a very key takeaway from this meeting. Now we are moving towards the implementation of the Defence White Paper. So from there, I would like to relate to a new development in Southeast Asia, the ending of the visiting forces between the Philippines and US. I think there will be some fundamental impact, spillover effects or concerns of a security gap in this region. And how do you think that the Defence White Paper and our force planning as well as our multilateral engagement would have to take some cue or move on this new development? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The security relationship between the Philippines and the US is an important one in this region in terms of providing part of the anchor for American forces in this region. So what's happened over the visiting forces agreement between the US and the Duterte administration is significant, but I think we have to see how this plays out over the next 6 months. So the government in Manila has made an initial gambit, and it may be a negotiating position rather than something final. But there is also an ambivalence within the Philippine administration over this. So this may not be a concrete decision. But if we assume that even if we assume that it is a firm decision on the Philippines' part, yes, that does do, I think, significant damage to the security relationship between the US and the Philippines. But there is more to that relationship than the visiting forces agreement. This would, breaching that agreement would make it impossible for the US to pursue the plans that they've had for forward basing, for example, maritime patrol aircraft and UAVs and other forces in the Philippines for surveillance over the South China Sea. But the mutual defense treaty between the two countries would remain intact. And if there was a change of administration in the future, maybe there'd be the possibility for reviving that VFA. But even if there wasn't, yes, that would damage US posture in the region. But of course, US military posture in the region is based essentially on aircraft carrier battle groups, and those are still able to deploy into the region. And the US has many other ways of projecting force, particularly naval force, into Southeast Asian waters. So it's not totally dependent on that VFA with the Philippines. And I think your question was really getting at the possible implications of the breach in the VFA for Malaysian defence policy. I wouldn't jump to conclusions about that. I don't think that there's any immediate need to think in terms, for example, of Malaysia needing to compensate for that. Malaysia already has an array of important defence engagement with the US. I think it would be important for both sides for that to continue, but I really don't think any knee-jerk reaction would be called for.
Okay. Yes.
Recommendations, the first, second, and third that you have mentioned about. My question is, how much value added giving the white paper of the three recommendations that you have given on posture, on decision of internal track, and internal prioritizing engagement? How would that value add to the defense white paper, and what benefits to the Ministry of Defense to the Inaugural?
Admiral, you're not going to write your next white paper.
Thank you, Admiral. A good question. Well, I made those suggestions because I think that this issue of Malaysia's fundamental international orientation, as I put it, and then the question of perhaps greater precision with respect to external security challenges, and then the strategy for international defense engagement, provide the vital geopolitical underpinnings for thinking about defense policy and defense strategy, force structure, capability improvements. It seems to me that it's vitally important to be clear about that basis, because everything else is built on top of it, or derives from it. You need to be clear about what sort of role Malaysia is projecting for itself in the region and more widely internationally, and what are the objectives. For example, the Kuala Lumpur Declaration of 1971 set out a vision of Southeast Asia as being a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, and that remains ASEAN's official doctrine in relation to its geopolitical position. So the question is, how seriously is Malaysia taking that, and does that remain an objective? In the white paper, there's talk at some points about active neutrality for Malaysia, at other points about non-alignment. It seems to me they're not, and at other points just simple neutrality. Those aren't interchangeable terms. So I do think it's important to be clear about that, because then that helps to influence and frame everything else that goes into the Defence White Paper. And in terms of prioritization and strategy for international and regional defence engagements, I think that's important, because ultimately that raises issues about coordination, burden sharing, joint approaches to regional security, and if the Defence White Paper process is ultimately to look forward not just 1 decade, but 2 or 3 decades, then in 30 years' time, we might be looking at potentially a much closer coordination between Southeast Asian countries, or closer coordination with external partners such as Australia, and then that would also have implications for force structure. So I think it's about providing a firm basis and a firm framework for the defence and military aspects of the White Paper.
I think there are 2 points there, Tim, and in reference to Admiral Ganesh's question, right? Because you made a suggestion that, defence white papers of the future, that if we should write it, we should have more beef in terms of the data that you find in the defence white paper. This defence white paper, I think, has been very silent on those kind of things. I think for good reason. For those of the armed forces, I think we understand it. But the larger issue actually is about how the defence posture of Malaysia correlates with the foreign policy of Malaysia. This is the issue that I think is problematic. And there has been a foreign ministry document that came out in the last few months. There's no reference between the 2 documents actually in terms of our deliberations. And I think it's something that those people who are planning and writing the white paper, those who are planning the defence force, those who are writing the white paper should be able to think about what the thinking of the foreign ministry is in terms of the larger context of international relations for Malaysia. So you mentioned the 1971 declaration. I doubt that many of them can remember that here. But it's an essential point. It's an essential point because, as Ahmad Nazri mentioned just now, right? What is our relationship with our neighbours in terms of our defence posture and our defence thinking? And that matters are quite sensitive to talk about. We do have some problems, undoubtedly, but all is shelved under the table, so to speak, so that we don't talk about it. So it's a very nice defence white paper. It's a non-threatening white paper. It's not something that everybody's going to get excited about in terms of what is Malaysia preparing to do in terms of its defence, in terms of its defence force for the next 10 years. That is very unclear to me. But if we're thinking that we need to deal with the contingencies that may arise, this is a problem that Malaysia faces. How do we deal with it? How do we deal with the China becomes more aggressive in the South China Sea? I've been trying to highlight this several times already. The defence white paper doesn't really say this is how we're going to respond to it. And then we need that. The defence chiefs need that, the service chiefs need that. So they will be able to gear the defence force to deal with it. Otherwise, what happens if there's another Lahad Datu that takes place in Malaysia? This is where I think the armed forces were basically, when the balloon went up, right, I think I have to say, we were not really prepared. And we were running about trying to figure it out, how we deal with this problem. So I think these are the areas that, seriously, I think we need to deal with it in a much more concrete way. Sorry, that's my intervention as chairman. I suppose I am entitled to that. Perhaps I can ask for one last question before we terminate. Yes, Captain, please. Captain Martin, right?
Thank you, sir. Dr. Tim, you wrote the Defending the Lion City, published in 2000, and you also wrote, I believe, Defending East Asia, 2017. I'd like to contrast your work with the work of Ken Booth in the book Strategic Cultures, where he dedicated a special chapter on Singapore and talked about the 5 defenses. He talked about social defense, military defense, political defense, economic defense, and he also talked about the one from public interest, those kind of stuff. So when I contrast your work with the Ken Booth's chapter, you see that defending the Lion City, it's just not about the size, it's about the comprehensiveness of Singapore in attaining a culture. When I mix these two, do you think that Malaysia has a flavor to build that culture to defend? Because in your opening statement today, you mentioned that the defense white paper is a defense paper. So a defense is also like what Bill Gates mentioned. It's not a nuclear bomb, but also a small virus that can paralyze a nation. So when you look at Ken Booth's idea of total defense and yours putting together Defending the Lion City, there's also other issues like security, which Singapore don't have, like smuggling, trafficking, illegal fishing, piracy, armed robbery, and those kind of stuff. So I take that question now, I put it over to Nazri. We are facing that. Security and defense, this balance. Security, $8 billion on cigarette smuggling, $6 billion on illegal fishing, and almost $12 billion on piracy. So this is the cost that we are facing, and then we are spending on defense. How do we need to merge this one on Pillar 2 when we come to interagency? And just one last question for both of you. We talked about coalition, we talked about partnership. Whose side are we going to be on? Because the future battle is going to be part of a coalition. Which coalition that we can't fight it individually, we need to be part of a coalition. Which coalition are we talking about? Thank you.
In the interest of time, we won't deal with, you're talking about budgetary allocations, right? In terms of dealing with specific problems that we have. I'm going to ask you first.
Alright, I think, thank you, Sebastian. You were asking about interagency correlation, connectivity. I think we are seeing that as a current problem, no doubt. Those losses are real. The exact figures, I think they are about just about that. What we are targeting once the Committee on Investment kicks in, chaired by the Prime Minister, we'll see closer cooperation, closer collaboration between the agencies, not just defense. When we look at all the resources, I mean, you know that pretty much Malaysia earned a lot of her income through maritime, so we are interlinked with not just the police, the MMDA and the customs and whatnot. The interlinkages has to be built again and strengthened. So we believe one of the primary driving would be this particular committee, the Defence Investment Committee. That is an interagency chaired by the Prime Minister, the highest there is, coupled with the oversight mechanism that we currently having at the Parliament itself. So I think just give it a try. We believe strongly that those combined committee as well as the oversight mechanism that are already in place will work to ensure better integration, tighter integration between the agencies.
Tim?
Yeah, thank you very much. Singapore and Malaysia are very different in many ways. In fact, you might say they couldn't be more different in terms of their defense and security predicaments. Singapore's predicament is one of smallness, acute dependence on external support, external sources of water and food, acute dependence on external trade, lack of territorial waters, lack of strategic depth. Malaysia's challenges are of much more expansive security interests and diverse challenges, geographical separation. In fact, distance and size is a challenge for Malaysia. But I think total defense, in the sense of looking at defense and security from a range of perspectives and integrating a whole of government approach into providing for defense and security is vital in both cases, despite the different challenges. So I don't really see a direct contrast between what I wrote about in Defending the Lion City and Ken Booth's approach. Ken Booth, by the way, is a good friend and one of my former teachers, and I don't feel that I'm in contradiction to what he wrote, but it's an interesting point. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this session began today with a keynote address with the Chief of Defence Force, and so it is my honor to invite the Chief of Defence Force to have the final word for this session. Sir.
I can't hold myself not to take part on the last part of this. By the way, when we look at turning national defense vision into reality, is like, you have a white paper and you want to realize it. If you are in my shoe, and it is become, they call it a CDF dilemma. Why? If you look through the white paper, it's good that they give you where to go and how to go. But it was not been specified to you how fast that you have to go there. So it come back to me and asking, how are you going to turn this into something which, if you have my background, who lived through the military, Malaysian armed forces all your life, you will know what the problem is. Because, of course, if you don't have my experience, your perspective about what paper said, you only see it from one angle. But we all do here, those who are sitting, the uniform people sitting in front on the nice comfy chair here, know exactly, oh my God, how I'm going to translate this. But the point is that what I'm trying to say is that we do seriously think about this. Now let's talk about one point so that most of us will understand and what will be our main dilemma here. When we talk about force projection, capability development, we're talking about system. When there is no system, in a system-dependent forces, there will be no capability. Then you all aware that system mean dollars and cents. Okay. Now you're talking about dollars and cents. when we put forward here, we are looking at the overall strategic environment. Now we're thinking about what best to be in place. Now we're talking about, next one is, how much does it cost? Yes, when you look at the quantum, you know, sometimes it is realistic, sometimes it is something which is non-doable. Where do we go from here? We are talking about getting allocation from the government, and government have their own priority, and as long as that priority doesn't change, that is what you will get. So now on one side I have to realize things, on the other side I have to depend on a central agency to give me things that I want. So I will not say all this detail, but I am sure with your experience you know where the gap is. So now we're talking about, you know, fulfilling the gap. Yes, give us time. By the time we are there, the overall, you know, the strategic situation change there, then we become outdated. Then we keep on having that chasing game. So now what do? Are we going to chase straight line, or we cut corners, so that we will spend less time trying to fill up the lost time, but be in position for the next technology or the situation change. So this is what we are looking at now. As it is now, it still become a CTF dilemma. Thank you very much.
Thank God I'm not in the CDF shoes. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of the session for this morning. I thank you all for your being a wonderful audience, and I'd like to ask you all to show our round of appreciation to our two speakers. Thank you very much.